Before he became one of the biggest rock and roll stars in America, before he packed nightclubs on the Sunset Strip and sold over 30 million records, Johnny Rivers was just a kid named John Henry Ramostella, born on November 7, 1942 in New York City. But New York was never going to be the place where his story truly began. When Johnny was just 5 years old, his family packed up and moved south to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, drawn there by his uncle, who worked at Louisiana State University. It was in Baton Rouge, along the muddy banks of the Mississippi, where the music first got inside him. Louisiana in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a cauldron of sound. Blues, country, gospel, and the raw beginnings of rock and roll spilled out of every juke joint, radio station, and church hall. Young Johnny soaked it all in. By the age of 8, he had picked up the guitar, taught by his father and uncle. There was something natural about the way the boy took to the instrument, something instinctive. He did not just learn to play, he learned to listen. And what he heard in that Louisiana air would shape everything that followed. By the time he reached junior high school, Johnny was already sitting in with a local band called the Rockets, led by a young musician named Dick Holler, who would later go on to write famous songs of his own, including the iconic tribute song about Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and the Kennedy brothers. But it was Johnny who stood out. He had a hunger that the other kids did not seem to possess, a restlessness that would not let him sit still. He formed his own band, the Spades, and at just 14 years old, while still a student at Baton Rouge High School, he recorded his very first single. The record appeared on the small Suede label, and though it barely made a ripple beyond the local scene, it marked the beginning of a professional career that would span more than 6 decades. In 1958, during a school break, 16-year-old Johnny traveled to New York City to stay with an aunt. He had a plan, and it was audacious for a teenager from Louisiana. He wanted to meet Alan Freed, the legendary disc jockey who was widely credited with popularizing the term rock and roll, and who had almost single-handedly brought the music to mainstream white audiences through his radio broadcasts and concert promotions. Somehow, improbably, the plan worked. Johnny got a meeting with Freed, and the older man was impressed enough to invite him to the Brill Building the very next day. At the Brill Building, the nerve center of the American music industry, the people who heard Johnny play liked what they heard. Freed also offered a piece of advice that would prove fateful. Like many Italian-American performers of that era, from Tony Bennett to Frankie Avalon to Dean Martin, a name change was suggested. Drawing on the young man's upbringing along the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, Freed proposed a new identity. John Henry Ramostella became Johnny Rivers. The name stuck, and a new chapter began. Freed helped Rivers land a recording contract with Gone Records, and between 1958 and 1959, Johnny released 3 singles. None of them sold well. The experience was deflating. He returned to Baton Rouge and began touring the American South, performing in clubs and roadhouses alongside comedian brother Dave Gardner. One evening in Birmingham, Alabama, Rivers crossed paths with Audrey Williams, the first wife of the late Hank Williams. She encouraged the young musician to try his luck in Nashville, and Rivers took her advice, relocating to Tennessee to pursue work as a songwriter and demo singer. In Nashville, Rivers worked alongside future country legend Roger Miller and honed his craft writing songs for other artists. By this point, he had almost given up on the idea of becoming a performer himself. Songwriting, he decided, was going to be his path. Then fate intervened once more. He met fellow Louisianan James Burton, the brilliant guitarist who played in Ricky Nelson's band. Burton took a tape of one of Rivers' songs back to California, and within a month, he called with news that Nelson had recorded it. The song appeared on Ricky Nelson's 1960 album for Imperial Records. It was a small victory, but it proved something important. Johnny Rivers could write songs that mattered. By 1961, Johnny Rivers had moved to Los Angeles, still hoping to make it as a songwriter and studio musician. He was 18 years old and already a veteran performer with 6 years of professional playing under his belt, but he had remarkably little to show for it. The music industry figures who had tried to give him breaks over the years, including Alan Freed himself, had fallen on hard times. Rivers was adrift in a city full of dreamers. Then, in 1963, something unexpected happened. A friend who ran a restaurant called Gazzari's, a nightclub in Hollywood, found himself in a bind when his house band, a jazz combo, suddenly quit. He appealed to Rivers for help. Johnny reluctantly agreed to fill in for a few nights, performing a stripped-down version of his rock and roll act with just his electric guitar and a drummer named Eddie Rubin. It was supposed to be temporary. Instead, it changed everything. The audiences loved it. There was something electric about the way Rivers played, something raw and honest that cut through the sophistication of the Hollywood club scene. Crowds grew. The temporary engagement became open-ended. Bassist Joe Osborne was hired to fill out the sound, and suddenly seeing Johnny Rivers became the thing to do in Los Angeles. It was at these gigs that Rivers connected with Lou Adler, a songwriter and music producer who recognized the commercial potential of what was happening on that small nightclub stage. In January 1964, a nightclub entrepreneur named Elmer Valentine opened the Whisky A Go-Go on the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood. The club had been open for just 3 days when the Beatles released their breakthrough American single, and the subsequent British invasion knocked almost every American artist off the top of the charts. Valentine gave Rivers a 1-year contract to be the house performer, and it proved to be an inspired decision. While the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were conquering America from across the Atlantic, Johnny Rivers was holding down the fort on the Sunset Strip, playing blistering live rock and roll that drew celebrity-packed audiences night after night. Lou Adler made a decision that would prove crucial. He arranged to record Rivers live at the Whisky and release the recordings as an album on the Imperial label. The result was Johnny Rivers Live at the Whisky A Go-Go, released in May 1964. The album was anchored by a ferocious cover of Chuck Berry's classic song about a long-distance phone call to a girl in Tennessee, and that single rocketed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. It sold over 1 million copies and earned a gold disc. The album itself reached number 12 on the charts and stayed there for 45 weeks. In an era completely dominated by British bands, an American kid from Baton Rouge playing 50s-style rock and roll and rhythm and blues had broken through. It was a remarkable achievement, and it was only the beginning. The magnitude of what Rivers had accomplished should not be underestimated. Since early 1964, the American charts had been dominated almost exclusively by British rock acts. American artists were picking up the scraps that were left over, struggling to compete with the wave of talent pouring across the Atlantic. And then along came this new kid from Baton Rouge, playing 50s-style rock and roll and rhythm and blues like he truly meant it. And he did mean it. Every note, every growl, every stinging guitar riff was delivered with absolute conviction. The audiences at the Whisky could feel it, and so could the record-buying public. What followed was one of the most consistent hit-making runs of the 1960s. Rivers released album after album, most of them recorded live at the Whisky A Go-Go, and the singles kept coming. His version of another Chuck Berry classic reached number 12. A cover of Harold Dorman's song about heartbreak on a mountainside went to number 9. His take on the traditional blues number that later became the theme song for a popular television concert series reached number 20. And a sizzling rendition of Willie Dixon's blues composition about a supernatural seventh-born son climbed to number 7 in the summer of 1965. Rivers was not just covering old songs. He was reinventing them, injecting them with an energy and urgency that made them sound vital and new. His live performances at the Whisky were legendary, drawing audiences that included some of the biggest names in Hollywood and the music industry. The club itself, with its go-go dancers gyrating in elevated cages above the crowd, became a symbol of the swinging 60s Los Angeles scene, and Rivers was at the very center of it all. In late 1964, the CBS television network acquired the rights to a British spy series called Danger Man and rechristened it for American audiences. The network needed a new theme song, and the job fell to songwriters P.F. Sloan and Steve Barry, whose publisher and producer Lou Adler also managed Rivers. Johnny recorded a brief version for the opening credits, barely a minute long. Nobody thought much of it at the time, but then something unexpected happened. Radio stations started requesting the song. Liberty Records began getting calls asking for a single. Rivers went back into the studio, recorded additional verses, and released it as a full single in 1966. It climbed to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, sold another million copies, and became one of the most iconic television theme songs ever recorded. To this day, it remains one of the songs most closely associated with Johnny Rivers, a driving, guitar-fueled anthem that captured the cool espionage glamour of the mid-60s perfectly. By 1966, Rivers was ready to evolve. He began moving away from the raw, live recording format that had made him famous, and started exploring more polished orchestral arrangements. The album Changes reflected this shift, and it produced the crowning achievement of his career as a performer. The song he co-wrote about growing up without wealth, a tender and soulful ballad with lush orchestration, became his only #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. It was a revelation. Here was the same man who had been tearing through blues covers at the Whisky, now delivering a heartbreaking ballad that showcased a completely different side of his artistry. But Rivers was not content to simply be a performer. He was also becoming a significant figure behind the scenes. In 1966, he founded his own record label, Soul City Records. One of the first acts he signed was a vocal group that had previously been known as the Hi-Fis. Rivers renamed them the Fifth Dimension, and under his guidance, they would go on to become one of the most successful vocal groups of the era, recording massive hits that topped the charts and earned multiple Grammy Awards. Rivers also hired a young, unknown songwriter named Jimmy Webb as an in-house writer for the label. Webb would go on to write some of the most celebrated songs in American popular music. Soul City Records became the first record company in history to win Grammy Awards for both Record of the Year and Song of the Year in its very first year of operation. Rivers was not just making music, he was building an empire. The hits kept flowing through 1967 and 1968. His soulful cover of a Motown classic, originally recorded by the Four Tops, reached the top 3. His version of a Miracles song about hidden heartbreak climbed to #10. And then came the dreamy, nostalgic single from 1968 that captured the psychedelic mood of the times, with its famous lyrical reference to a certain landmark Beatles album playing on a jukebox. That song reached #14 and remains a fan favorite to this day. The accompanying album, Realization, peaked at #5 on the album charts and is widely considered by fans and critics alike to be the finest work of his career. A sophisticated blend of psychedelic influences, soulful ballads, and introspective songwriting. In 1967, Rivers performed at the Monterey Pop Festival, sharing a bill with some of the most legendary acts in rock history. He was at the peak of his powers, a genuine superstar with 9 top 10 hits, his own record label, a roster of talent that included the Fifth Dimension and Jimmy Webb, and a reputation as one of the most exciting live performers in America. He had sold millions of records. He had helped define an era. The rise of Johnny Rivers seemed unstoppable. But as the 1960s drew to a close, the ground beneath Johnny Rivers began to shift. The music world was transforming at a dizzying pace. The clean-cut pop and polished production that had defined the mid-60s were giving way to something rawer, heavier, and more experimental. Jimi Hendrix was reinventing what an electric guitar could do. The counterculture was in full bloom. Artists were growing their hair long, embracing psychedelia, and pushing musical boundaries in ways that made the Whisky a Go-Go sound feel like a relic of an earlier age. Rivers tried to keep up. He let his hair grow longer. He grew a beard. The Realization album had incorporated psychedelic influences, and he continued to experiment with more introspective and thoughtful material. But somehow, he always seemed to be one step behind the cultural moment. The artists who were now capturing the public imagination were shaggier, louder, and more confrontational than Rivers had ever been. His commercial appeal began to slacken through 1969, and though his music remained critically respected, the chart positions told a different story. By the end of 1969, Rivers had divested himself of his interest in Soul City Records, selling the operational rights while keeping the name. He ceased making personal appearances. The man who had been the king of the Sunset Strip, who had single-handedly made the Whisky a Go-Go the hottest nightclub in America, was stepping back from the spotlight. It was a decision born partly of exhaustion, partly of disillusionment, and partly of a recognition that the world he had conquered no longer existed in the same form. The 60s were over, and everything they had meant was being rewritten in real time. The 1970s brought sporadic success, but nothing approaching the sustained dominance of the previous decade. Rivers continued to record, releasing albums that earned praise from critics, but failed to connect with the broader public the way his earlier work had. In 1972, his album L.A. Reggae produced a top 10 cover of a classic 1957 rhythm and blues number about a strange illness, which sold well enough to keep his name in the conversation. In 1973, he had a moderate hit with his version of a Carl Perkins rockabilly standard. In 1975, he covered a Beach Boys #1 hit, with Brian Wilson himself contributing background vocals, and it reached the top 40. But these were isolated moments of brightness in what was becoming an increasingly dim landscape. Rivers was no longer setting trends. He was chasing them, hopping from label to label, recording for Atlantic, Epic, and Big Tree, searching for the right combination of sound and timing that would return him to the heights he had known. The magic formula eluded him. His last top 10 hit came in 1977, a smooth, sensuous, soft rock number about slow dancing that reached number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was a beautiful song, warm and romantic, and it proved that Rivers could still deliver a hit when everything aligned. But it was also a farewell of sorts. His very last appearance on the Hot 100, also in 1977, was a cover of a Curtis Mayfield composition. After that, the charts went silent on Johnny Rivers. The 1980s were unkind to many artists of Rivers' generation, and he was no exception. He released the album Borrowed Time in 1980 and landed an interview on American Bandstand with Dick Clark in 1981, but his recording career was winding down rapidly. The music industry had moved on to new wave, synth pop, and the MTV revolution. There was no place on the charts for a rock and roll artist from the 60s who sang covers of blues and rhythm and blues standards with a guitar, a bass, and a drum kit. Around this time, Rivers underwent a profound personal transformation. He turned to Christianity, and the spiritual shift seemed to pull him further from the mainstream music world. He recorded a gospel album called Not a Through Street for Priority Records and essentially retired from the recording business. For years, the man who had sold 30 million records and launched the careers of the Fifth Dimension and Jimmy Webb was largely absent from the public consciousness. It was a striking fall from grace. In the span of less than 15 years, Johnny Rivers had gone from being one of the biggest names in American music, a chart-topping superstar with his own record label and a string of gold records, to a virtual afterthought in an industry that devoured its own with ruthless efficiency. The hits stopped. The album stopped. The spotlight moved on to younger, flashier artists who had no memory of the nights when Rivers had set the Sunset Strip on fire. His records gathered dust in bargain bins. His name appeared in nostalgia columns and oldies radio playlists, but the mainstream music press had moved on entirely. It was as if Johnny Rivers had never happened. And yet, the music he had made during his peak years remained in circulation, played on classic rock and oldies stations across the country. His spy thriller theme continued to appear in films and television shows, introducing his sound to new generations who had no idea who was singing. The Fifth Dimension, the group he had discovered and named, continued to be celebrated as one of the great vocal ensembles in pop history. Jimmy Webb, the songwriter he had championed, went on to write songs that are now considered among the finest ever written in the English language. The ripple effects of Johnny Rivers' career continued to spread outward, even as the man himself retreated from view. But Johnny Rivers was never quite finished. In 1998, he reactivated his Soul City Records label and released Last Train to Memphis, his first new studio album in 15 years. It was not a blockbuster. It did not return him to the charts. But it was a statement of survival, a declaration that the music still mattered to him even if the industry had moved on. In 2000, Rivers found himself in remarkable company when he recorded alongside Eric Clapton, Tom Petty, and Paul McCartney on a tribute album dedicated to the Crickets, Buddy Holly's legendary backup band. It was a reminder that even if the public had forgotten Johnny Rivers, his peers had not. The musicians who understood the history of rock and roll knew exactly who he was and what he had contributed. Rivers continued to tour steadily through the 2000s and 2010s, performing 50 to 60 shows a year, increasingly returning to the blues that had inspired him as a boy in Baton Rouge. He played casinos, county fairs, and small theaters, a far cry from the packed Hollywood nightclubs of his heyday, but he played with the same passion and commitment that had always defined him. In 2004, he released Reinvention Highway, a studio album praised for its maturity and rootsy feel. On June 12, 2009, Johnny Rivers was inducted into the Louisiana Music Hall of Fame, a recognition of his deep roots in the state's rich musical tradition. It was a meaningful honor, but it also highlighted a glaring absence. Despite 9 top 10 hits, 17 top 40 hits, over 30 million records sold, the founding of a Grammy-winning record label, the discovery of the Fifth Dimension, and the mentoring of Jimmy Webb, Johnny Rivers has never been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His name has been suggested many times. He was nominated for induction into America's Pop Music Hall of Fame in 2015, but the call from Cleveland has never come, and for many music historians and fans, it represents one of the most baffling oversights in the Hall's history. In 2019, Johnny Rivers announced his farewell tour. After more than 6 decades of performing, the man who had been born John Henry Ramostella in New York City, who had grown up along the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, who had renamed himself after that very river on the advice of a legendary disc jockey, was preparing to say goodbye. The farewell tour was delayed and extended by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But in July 2023, at the Commerce Casino near Los Angeles, not far from the Sunset Strip where it had all begun, Johnny Rivers played his final show. On April 9, 2017, Rivers had performed one of the most poignant concerts of his later career when he played a song at the funeral of Chuck Berry, the very artist whose music had given Rivers his first massive hit with that electrifying cover recorded live at the Whisky A Go-Go more than 50 years earlier. Standing on the stage at the pageant in St. Louis, Missouri, accompanying himself on acoustic guitar, Rivers paid tribute to the man whose spirit had animated so much of his own career. It was a moment that encapsulated the full circle of a life lived in music. So what do we make of the rise and fall of Johnny Rivers? The numbers tell one story. 9 top 10 hits, 17 top 40 hits, over 30 million records sold, a #1 single, albums that stayed on the charts for nearly a year, a record label that won Grammy Awards in its very first year of operation, the discovery of the Fifth Dimension, the nurturing of Jimmy Webb, the creation of the go-go scene on the Sunset Strip, the popularization of the live album as a mainstream commercial format. By any objective measure, Johnny Rivers was one of the most important and successful figures in the history of American rock and roll. But the fall tells another story, a story that is not really about Johnny Rivers at all. It is about the merciless nature of popular culture, the way it chews through artists and spits them out, the way it rewards novelty above all else and punishes those who cannot or will not reinvent themselves quickly enough to keep pace with the relentless churn of taste and fashion. Rivers was not a chameleon like David Bowie or a provocateur like the Rolling Stones. He was, at his core, a rock and roll purist, a man who loved the music of Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters and who wanted nothing more than to play that music with all the passion and skill he could muster. When the world wanted something different, he tried to adapt, but his heart was always in the blues. There is something both admirable and tragic in that. Admirable because authenticity is rare in an industry built on artifice. Tragic because the very quality that made Johnny Rivers special, his unwavering devotion to the roots of rock and roll, was also the quality that ensured he would eventually be left behind by an industry that craved the next new thing. Johnny Rivers once said that he saw himself primarily as a songwriter, even though most of his biggest hits were covers of other people's songs. There is a beautiful irony in that. A man who could take someone else's composition and make it sound so completely his own that audiences assumed he had written it. That is a rare gift, and it is a gift that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has yet to properly acknowledge. But halls of fame and chart positions and sales figures are, in the end, just numbers on a page. What matters is the music itself, and the music of Johnny Rivers endures. On any given night, somewhere in America, someone is hearing his spy thriller theme song for the first time and feeling a thrill run up their spine. Someone is discovering that soulful ballad about growing up poor and feeling their heart break a little. Someone is listening to that dreamy 1968 track about summer rain and a Beatles album playing on a jukebox and being transported to a time and place they never knew but somehow recognize. That is the true legacy of Johnny Rivers. Not the rise, not the fall, but the music that outlasts them both.